So today we have got day 4 of our kinesiology class, which is where we're really going to break into biomechanics today. So this is going to be a lot of anatomic terminology. So we're learning a language today, right? We're going to take a break from all the major science of movement and anatomy and physiology, and really we're just going to kind of take it and start looking at science as it relates to human movement, which means we have to have like a very clear language. We do not want there to be any interpretation of what it means to raise your arm, right? Because I could raise my arm like this. I could go this way, I could go this way, right? Both of those are raising my arm, right? I mean, heck, that's raising it, it's still going up, right? But like there's a difference between like flexion, which is going this way, extension, which is going this way, abduction, which is going this way. And then heck, I guess I could raise my arm across my body weirdly like that, right? That's adduction, right? So there's a little bit of a difference between all those things. We need to have a language in order to understand them. That way we can label out our exercises and we can label out our muscles, right? Like certain muscles are going to do abduction. We need to know which muscles do those, right? What's up, Marjan? What's your question?
Sorry, I'm trying to lower you a little bit down because everybody's sleeping. So I can't. I don't know how to do it. Is it something that you have control of it?
I do not. Are you on a PC or are you on a Mac?
Well, I mean,
Windows or Mac?
PC, Windows, yeah.
Windows. So in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah, I'm trying to, but it's not going to.
So there, do you see the little speaker symbol?
Yes. Okay.
So click that once, and then you should see like a little thing that looks kind of like this, and you should be able to drag it down.
Okay, it's a microphone, right?
Not the microphone. It should say speakers.
Oh, speakers. Okay.
There is a microphone one, but you want to click the speaker.
I see the speaker. Sorry about that.
You got it?
No, not the speaker. No, doesn't show any speaker.
There should also, if it's a laptop, there should be a speaker button somewhere on probably like my keyboard, like it would be up towards the F buttons, towards the top of the keyboard.
Sorry, I keep you just
I don't know. I can't see your computer. You have headphones?
No, that's a good question. So don't worry about it. Sorry about that. Like it's okay. Go ahead. I'll figure out something. Like
okay.
I'm just playing with it. So
yeah, just goof around with it, and you know what. But if you can see my screen right now, right? You can see me, right?
No, I can't. Hold on. Now I can see it.
Okay, so watch my mouse, right? I would click this button, the speakers button, and I would grab this and drag it this way, and that would lower the volume.
That's what I did, but it's not working. That's exactly what I did, and it's like pretty much is like 7, but you still. That's why I asked you, like, is it something that you have control of it, or?
Definitely not. No, that would be too much power for a Zoom call. if the speaker had control of your.
Oh, there you go. I got it. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. So, okay, let's go through. So we're talking about biomechanics, right? So this is going to be our language. So purpose of today's lesson, we want you guys to have a pretty good understanding of the terminology used to describe human movement and how that works. We want you guys to know a couple different things. We're going to go through anatomic terminology. So that's going to be a little bit just labeling. Honestly, it's just going to be understanding like what is up, what is down, what is left, what is right, what is center, what is, distal. Planes of motion. Planes of motion are generally where our movements take place. So like usually you are moving front to back, side to side, or you are twisting, right? And then we'll look at joint movement. So we're going to get some really cool terms today where we're looking at the difference between like flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, things like that. I am only going to go through the basics today. We'll get into the really complicated ones later. muscle actions. So we'll look at the difference between when a muscle is shortening versus when a muscle is lengthening. And then we're going to look at all of that as it relates to human movement in general, right? So like understanding where something is now, the biomechanical anatomic location, right? Versus where it ends up is going to move through a specific plane of motion, and we're going to label that based on like what direction it's going and what muscles being used and how the angle is changing. That's what we call our joint motions. And then we'll talk about whether a muscle is shortening to do that or whether a muscle is lengthening to do that. And that's where our muscle actions come in. So this PowerPoint's really well put together in terms of how it like builds on itself. But we'll start with the basics. We're just going to look at our location, right? And actually, even before we get into that, a couple definitions, just because sometimes they ask you about this. Honestly, guys, this is the easy, like if you get this question as like your kinesiology question on your NASM test, you got it easy, you know. But it's just two terms here. The first one is biomechanics, right? That's the study of how our internal and external, our internal mechanisms are acting upon like external forces, right? So it's basically like how our body is interacting with the world, right? How is, you know, the weight of this glass of water, you know, affecting the muscles in my body? Like how do they have to contract in order to do that? How do my joints have to move through specific ranges of motion, right? It's the motion that your kinetic chain, that's your muscular, skeletal, and nervous system, produce, and then all the forces that are also acting upon it, right? So one of my favorite ways to understand biomechanics is to think of like a dumbbell, right? If I took a dumbbell and raised it out like this with a straight arm, let's say it's 5 pounds, right? That's going to feel, you know, X amount heavy, right? But if I did it with a bent elbow and I did the exact same thing, right? Like I got my elbow bent here, but like the movement in my shoulder, this is the same, right? Nothing has changed over in my shoulder. The, you know, the lift is still exactly the same, but the weight is going to feel drastically lighter. And that's because the weight is closer to the muscle itself. So there's less what we call torque. So that's kind of one of the fun ones. We're going to look at torque tomorrow, actually, but that's one of the reasons why I love studying biomechanics. I think it's a really fascinating science. This is why you see so many people cheating in the gym. You know, they arch their back, they tilt, you know, do all these like, you know, funky angles that, you know, sort of adjust things. So that's our biomechanics. Then we also have our anatomic terminology. This is a language that we're going to use to describe specific locations in the body. That way, you and I, we never have a miscommunication, right? You know, there's a difference between like proximal, which is close to something, and distal, which is far away, right? That way, like we don't describe, oh, it's like near this, right? Like it's like that's good, but it's like a little bit too simple. You know, like imagine like a doctor, right? For example, right? Like let's say like a doctor is giving like, you know, directions to another doctor, like you, because that's how it works, right? You've got like, you know, one doctor does like your x-ray and then sends it over to another specialist to look at and analyze, right? And they would say like, hey, the damage is, and they would describe it very clearly so that they know exactly like where to look, rather than just being like, oh, they have a break in their arm, right? It's a little bit just too general, you know? So it allows for very effective communication. We don't want to, you know, kind of get confused here. So when we talk about our anatomic terminology, the big thing I want you to remember, and this is, you know, everything is going to rely on this point that I'm going to make. When it comes to anatomic terminology, everything that we are describing always is in reference to the anatomic position. So here's what's really great about us not being, you know, again, very like set of communication, right? The anatomic position takes away any of our arguments, right? Or it takes away like the relativity of like how we're going to describe things. So what I mean by the anatomic position is, I mean, you're going to have a person standing with their palms facing forward, standing upright, toes pointed forward, feet, knees, everything just in regular old alignment directly under the hips. Everything is like in a very neutral position. The only thing that seems a little weird is like the hands facing forward like this. generally people stand with their palms like facing inward. We call that the fundamental position, which we don't use as often, even though that's probably much more naturally how we stand. Also, we usually have like the toes pointing out a little bit for most people. But the anatomic position is, feet shoulder width apart, toes pointed straight forward, with, legs under hips, under knees, perfectly in alignment there. Arms at your sides, palms facing forward. That's the anatomic position. So here's why this is important. If I said, like this muscle is superior to another muscle. Superior is a position above a point of reference, right? So if I said like this muscle is above like another muscle, you might have somebody be like, well, what if they're standing on their hands? What if they're upside down? Wouldn't it be the exact opposite, right? And then we would all get confused because we wouldn't be able to describe like where stuff is. You know what I mean? So we have to have a specific starting point. If we know the starting point, we can know like where things are actually adjusting around and where they're located, right? So that's the anatomic position. It's this starting point, right? Like my favorite example of this that makes this actually very clear is in a little bit, we're going to talk about the difference between internal rotation and external rotation, right? So internal rotation, let's see here if I can find a good picture that'll. Yeah, actually that's great. We'll use the rotator cuff picture here. So here's kind of an example of like internal rotation versus external rotation, right? Now this baseball player's arm is all the way cocked back, like, 180 degrees. That's a pretty good range of motion, right? So that is going to be what we consider external shoulder rotation. And then he's going to rotate it this way into internal shoulder rotation when he goes to throw the ball, right? So he's cocked back like this in external rotation. He would move forward like that for using internal rotation to throw the baseball, right? Now, here's where I've had people like, get on me about this, right? People who don't understand anatomic terminology properly. This is where the argument can take place, right? So if I kind of blow this up here, right? I've had people say, well, what of the fact that it's a circle, right? Like technically, it's when he's moving his arm this way, that's internal rotation because it's a circle. Like at halfway through the circle, it would become internal rotation, right? Like you hear that argument. From a language perspective, I kind of get that. I'm like, yeah, you're right. Circles are never ending, right? Like there is no starting point to a circle. It's uninterrupted, right? So I hear what you're saying because, you would say it like a stopped clock is right twice a day. Because, it at some point at 50% of the way, it becomes internal and at the other 50% it becomes external. I hear what you're saying. In anatomic terminology, though, that is not true because we have a starting point. If you had a circle like this, that is a perfect circle, yeah, absolutely. There's no beginning, there's no end, it just continues, right? But in our version, we have a starting point. We have a starting point, which is right here, which means it goes this way, right? Like we know what direction the circle goes. You know what I mean? Because we were given a starting point. And so because we have a starting point, we have a very specific way to speak of this. Our starting point in the world of anatomic terminology is the anatomic position. So if I say something is flexion, I mean that it's starting here and moving like this, right? It always comes from here. So it's almost like in your brain, you have to sort of unfold your client's body depending on what position they're in. Like a lunge and a squat biomechanically are basically the same thing. There's a little bit of a difference there for sure, but they are both examples of a movement that is considered triple extension because at the ankle, knee, and hip, there is going to be extension of the muscles there, right? Those joints are going to extend. And you could argue it's like, well, what about the part of the lunge where they're going down? Or what about the part of the squat where they're sitting into the squat? Isn't that flexion? Yes, it is, right? But we're talking about the force production part of the movement, which is extension for both of those movements. If you unfold their body, you will notice that the hip is pressing back, the knees are extending, right? It's a very specific language where it all comes together. So we have to have this starting point. The starting point is going to be the anatomic position. You may get a question about the anatomic position, by the way. You may get asked to define this. Like as a test question, you might be like, they might say like blank is considered the anatomic position. It's the position with the body erect, so it's just standing upright, with the palms at your sides, arms at your sides, palms facing forward. Okay. That way, if we know that this palm is facing forward, now we have pronation and supination. We have a specific starting point, so we can have that language, right? And then the fundamental position is the exact same thing, except your palms are facing inward, which is sort of how we actually stand. So when you consider it, it's like you're standing in a little bit of internal rotation, right? Like this is the starting position here. But the fact that we actually stand kind of like this, that's a little bit of internal shoulder rotation. We don't stand like this and walk around like that all day. That would be major internal rotation. But again, think of the circle and think of the starting point of the circle, right? That's our anatomic position. So let's go ahead and look at some of these locations on the body, right? So we have got our first term, which is going to be superior, right? Superior is a position above a point of reference. You can see that here. By the way, I'm going to kind of flip back and forth between the slides here, just so I can keep coming back to this picture. So superior is a position above a point of reference, right? Your head is considered superior to your sternum, which is, your breastbone, right? Or like the femur, that's your thigh bone, is superior to your tibia, that's your shin bone, right? So superior is above a point of reference. Now, like I said, memorizing these terms, guys, it's very easy to do when you do them in opposites. So if we think of like superior as up, what's the opposite of up? It's down, right? So that's where we have inferior. Inferior is a position below a point of reference. So when you're working on like understanding this terminology and memorizing these things, memorize those two together, right? Superior up, inferior down. It's just like, I think I said this on Friday. I don't know how many of you guys were in that class. But I was saying, if you ever played catchphrase, or if you've ever played like heads up, you're trying to get somebody to guess something, but you're not allowed to tell them, you're not allowed to use the words that you're trying to get them to guess. One of the best ways to do that is just to tell them the opposite, right? Like, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say I'm not allowed to say like Batman's name, right? Or I can't say like, Batgirl or anything like that, which would get you to Batman because they're similar, because it's got the word bat in it, right? But what I can say is like, oh, this is the guy who's the opposite of the Joker. Those are total opposites of one another, right? They're just like an antagonist. So it's a good way to kind of memorize this stuff. So superior is above, which means inferior is going to be below. Picture an elevator, right? If it goes up, you're going superiorly. If it goes down, it goes inferior. It can't move side to side. It's just an elevator. It goes straight up and down. So inferior, like your heel bone, your calcaneus, that's inferior to your patella, right? It's below your knee bone. Your soleus, that's your calf muscle, is inferior to the hamstring, which is directly above it, right? Your hamstring is the upper thigh. Your soleus is sort of the back of your heel. Next one we've got proximal and distal. Proximal is going to be a position nearest the center of the body. Now that one's kind of interesting because like center means like it goes in all directions. It just goes towards the center, right? Like you have to actually picture a circle, right? So if I kind of just like draw like a big circle here, right? Proximal is towards the center of this, right? Let's see. We'll put like a little line in the middle here. So that's the middle, but it's not just the center. That's also the middle, but that's not the center. But this, where the two middles meet, that's the center. So proximal is going to be moving towards the center, right? So if you think of like the center of your body as like your navel, you know, your belly button, and you want to become like, you want to move something more proximal, you're going to be moving it towards your center, right? So for instance, you know, your eyes are more proximal proximal to the nose when compared with the ears. That's another thing that's kind of cool about proximal, is you can give it like 2 points of reference. Like you could say what is closer to, and then say something else, right? Like my eyes are closer to my nose than my ears are, right? So this is within proximity, whereas this is not, right? Or like, you know, and my nose is like right along the medial line there. That's, you know, closer, that's more proximal than my eyes are if we just say it in general, right? If there's no point of reference giving, we are going to talk about the dead center of the body, pretty much right here at the belly button. But usually when you're using proximal and distal, you'll say a point of reference. Like my elbow is more proximal compared to my wrist, right? Like my wrist is further away, like you have to draw a line that's further from my wrist to my center compared with my elbow to my center. And then distal is exactly the opposite. Distal, you want to think distance, right? It's at a distance. Distal is further away from the center of the body, or further away from a point of reference, right? So proximal is nearest to the center, distal is further from the center. Your fingers are more distal than your wrist. Your wrist is closer to the center than your fingers are. So this one you can kind of picture like an escalator. This one kind of moves in really like two directions at the same. It goes up a little bit, but it can go to the side as well. Kind of does it at the same time, you know, in either direction there. So your lumbar spine, that's your low back, is more proximal to the tailbone than like your thoracic spine would be, or in this case, I got the breastbone there. But you think about like your low back is closer to your tailbone than your upper back would be. And then your sternum is more distal than that, right? That's much further away. Then we've got anterior and posterior. This is probably the two easiest ones. Anterior is on the front of the body. Posterior is on the back of the body. So if you've ever been at the gym, let's see if I can find a picture of this. Gym machine, anterior deltoid. You know, at the gym, you'll always see like, yeah, this machine right here, the combo deltoid machine, right? Oh, way to go. That was literally it. Come back. There it is. So in this version, this deltoid machine, right, you can flip this machine around. If you've ever been to the gym and you sat down on this thing, you can do chest flies going this way, right? But you can also grab it and you flip the pins and you go the other way, and then you can pull it back. You know, you can go this way as well. So I can either go here or I can go here with that machine. Well, guess what? One of them works the anterior part of my body and one of them works the posterior part of my body. Anterior is on the front, posterior is on the back. So this is the anterior or ventral side. I don't usually use ventral or dorsal. And this is the posterior or dorsal side. So anterior, posterior, right? Anterior deltoid, posterior deltoid. Okay, so anterior on the front, posterior on the back. Easy way to remember that, or at least the way I remember it, is like my mom, whenever she would like threaten to like spank me when I was like misbehaving as a child, you know, she would always like she would always threaten my posterior because she didn't want to, like, you know, she wouldn't want to say like that in public, you know, what she was just like, I'm gonna hit you on the posterior, and I'm like, oh god, you know. Your gluteus maximus, right? That's the posterior part of your body. That's the most posterior. That's the part of you, right? And then your palms, right? That's very anterior. And the reason the palms are anterior is because from the anatomic position, they're facing forwards. That's my favorite example, actually, on this whole list, because it does take the two together, right? Your palms are facing forward, therefore your palms are considered anterior. And I know that's kind of weird in your brain because they kind of sit, you know, posterior or like at least middle most of the day. Usually you've got your palm face down, right? But no, in the anatomic position, which is here, right, the palm is considered anterior. So that's a very good example kind of putting those two things together. Then we got medial. Medial is towards the midline. So again, remember, the middle is different from the center. Center is where the two middles meet, right? But medial is just this one, right? Going towards the center, whereas lateral would be this one, going away from the center, okay? So medial is going towards the middle. I said center both times. Sorry, I didn't mean center. Medial is going towards the middle. Lateral is going away from the middle. My apologies. Center is where both middles meet. And that is just horizontal movement, right? That is just horizontal movement. Picture a moving sidewalk, right? The moving sidewalks at the airport, right? It just goes side to side. It doesn't go in any other direction, right? It's just literally going side to side. So medial and lateral are moving this way, like this way. They don't go this way, right? That would be anterior, posterior. That's also kind of a moving sidewalk, right? But medial and lateral are just sort of left and right, honestly. But like it wouldn't work like that, because if you move to the right or to the left, you're moving lateral, moving towards your midline, that's medial. So your nose is medial compared to your ears, right? Because it's closer to the midline. My eyes are more medial as well, but in this example, my eyes are more lateral. They flank laterally to my nose. Both your pectorals are lateral compared to your sternum, you know. Now we got a couple weird ones where we put some terms together. This is where we got contralateral and ipsilateral. So contralateral, right? You know, if I told if I was like, you know, hey, the best superhero in all of like comic books is Spider-Man. And, you know, and you're sitting there and you're listening to me and you're like, I don't know about that. I think the best character in comic books is probably Batman, right? And we get into an argument about, we are contradicting each other, right? So that's contralateral. This is, you know, we have the opposite opinion if we're contradicting one another. Contralateral is on the opposite side of the body. So my left eye is contralateral to my right eye. My left eye is contralateral to my right ear. My left side of my body is contralateral to my right side. My right side is contralateral to my left side, right? So contralateral is on the opposite. The right hand is contralateral to the left hand. Now, ipsilateral means on the same side, right? So ipsilateral refers to a position on the same side of the body. The left hand is ipsilateral to the left foot or the left eye or the left ear, whatever, right? They're on the same side of the body. That one's always really handy when we talk about like where to hold a dumbbell. Usually you're going to hold a dumbbell in the contralateral side, right? If we look at like a single leg Romanian deadlift with kettlebell, right? You'll notice she is going to hold this kettlebell in the contralateral side, right? So like we look here, you can see she's got her right leg down and she's holding the dumbbell in this case, not kettlebell, but holding the dumbbell in the left arm. So contralateral, right? That's usually how we do it. Now she could do ipsilateral, by the way. If she wanted to hold that dumbbell on this side, she can do that. The problem with it though, is it often like opens up the hip and then you're working the wrong muscles and stuff. That's why we do this, is because it creates balance in the body. If she's got a closed chain position between her foot and the floor, right? She's got a lot of stability here. Well, the weight is also pulling down, so that's also creating stability. That's why we go on the opposite side of the body. So we create stability through the midline rather than loading up one side and causing your client to like tilt. If you guys have ever wondered why we hold dumbbells in a specific arm, that's why. And then we got two more positions here. We've also got prone versus supine. So prone is going to be, now this is kind of a weird one, but it's going to be a position face downward. Okay. So like when you are pronated, for instance, you are facing something downwards. If we look at like foot pronation, you can actually see what that means is we're sort of taking the foot and we are, getting even more contact with the ground downward, right? I'm sort of showing my foot downward much more. Whereas supinated, and you can even see actually, if I find like a foot contact picture here, supinated is where you have a sort of a hollow arch, right? It's more like away, sort of going upwards, right? So pronation is like way too much contact with the ground, and supination is not enough contact with the ground. That's why normal foot contact, we sort of want those 3 points right here, here, and here. We'll talk more about that later. We'll get into the foot and ankle complex later this week, but pronation or prone is a position downwards, right? If you've ever like come home from a hard day of work and you're just like, you flop on the bed, right? You're in a prone position. So look at all these, like, there's not like these are all pictures of just, okay, there we go. There's some people. I was like, these are all just like drawings. And then supine is face up. So supine would be laying face up. So, when you're lounging on the couch, for instance, you're probably very supine, I imagine. Boy, excuse me. So this also takes place in your wrist, right? You have got a pronated wrist, which is this, face down, and then you've got a supinated wrist, which is face up. Easy way to remember that is, guys, my favorite version of this is, hey, give me soup. Right? So if you imagine like, give me soup, we can place it in your palm, right? Your wrist is supinated. Pronated is going to be face down. It's funny. The first time I ever learned that term was actually not in one of my biology classes. I learned supinated the first time in high school, not in biology, not in anatomy, but in an acting class when we had to do a stage combat scene with swords and do like a little bit of sword fighting. There was a little bit of difference between like holding the blade supinated versus holding it pronated. And that was like, haha, I'm fencing versus like I'm stabbing. So those are our anatomic locations. And that's really just gonna be where stuff sort of exists on the body in its baseline, right? We're gonna look at the anatomic position. You can see here, right? She's facing forward. Her palms are facing forward, feet are just at her sides, and then stuff is either going to be superior or inferior, anterior or posterior, medial towards the midline or lateral away from the midline, ipsilateral, that's on the same side, contralateral, that'll be on the opposite side. Things might be proximal towards the center or distal away from the center. Any questions on those terms, guys? Any review on that you guys need? How y'all feeling? Love that. By the way, good to see you, Simon. I didn't say hi earlier.
It's all good. I was
You missed my baseball example earlier, by the way.
Where's the baseball? I'll just re-look at it.
It wasn't that important. You're good. All right, guys. Let's go ahead and move into the next one. So next one we got to look at our planes of motion. Now, with our planes of motion, we are also going to have a lot of specific joint actions. So there are going to be specific movements that can only occur in specific planes. Now, I will contradict myself right now and say, like, for the record, movement generally occurs in one plane of motion. Obviously, there's going to be some accessory movement. So this isn't always going to be perfect. Like, for instance, you think about like somebody who's doing like a squat, right? Their knees might wobble a little bit, right? It's like, yeah, most of that movement is very sagittal. It's going front to back, right? But obviously, if their knees are rotating in, it's like, ooh, now they're getting some rotational movement. So it's going to be very transverse. So generally, movement is going to occur in one plane of motion at a time, which is how we're going to learn it, because then we can go, oh, so you're moving outside of the plane that you're supposed to be moving through. That's why that's not good form, right? That's why that's going to put too much stress on the body. That's why that's going to cause an injury. So we're just going to get a little more specific about this language here. So there's going to be 3 planes of movement. We're going to look at that first, right? So of these planes, you've got the frontal plane. So you can see the front and you can see the back. So it's going to move side to side, actually. So the frontal plane are movements that are side to side like this, right? So I'm doing a frontal plane movement here, or I'm doing a frontal plane movement here, or, you know, here, or if I just like move side to side like this, those are very frontal plane movements, right? So I want you to imagine I'm being divided down the middle, right? If you cut me in half, right, and you cut me in half down the middle this way, down the side. So I've got a front half now and a back half now, right? That is going to be the frontal plane. You can see the front, right? So anything that moves side to side like this is a frontal plane movement. Think lateral raises, think side shuffling, right? The sagittal plane cuts us into sagittal planes. So we get a left side and a right side. So now if I moved along the plane with the cut, right, if the cut goes this way, right, I can move along it this way. That's front to back action, right? So this is very sagittal, right? Front to back is sagittal. So I've got a left side and a right side. And then we've got the transverse plane. The transverse plane is going to cut me into an upper part and a lower portion. So like when I twist, for instance, like my chair, right? My chair it can move in a transverse motion because it's got like a, you know, it pivots this way or that way, right? This is very transverse, right? Or like my head, right? That's very transverse. If you chopped off my head and put it back on, you can do a whole, you know, you could spin me all the way around at that point. But it's got a lot of like side to side, you know, rotational movement. So internal rotation versus external rotation, we talked about that at the beginning of this lesson, right? Internal rotation and external rotation are both taking place in the transverse plane because they are rotating, right? So let's get a little more specific about that, because now if we understand that those are kind of the planes, right? I've got movements that can be very frontal. You know, I can do this kind of stuff, right? What's that flossing thing? You know, that's a very frontal plane movement. But like, yeah, side to side, right? Anything where I move like this is very frontal. And then I've got movements that are going to take place here going front to back, right? That's very sagittal, right? My arms, my legs, right? Front to back like this. And then I've got the transverse stuff. That's going to be twisting, right? Rotational movements, right? Anything where I'm swinging and rotating, right? So I've got an upper and a lower. So you just kind of want to think of it as like sliding along the plane. What I used to do in school when I was trying to learn this stuff, I go to a wall, right? And then like, if I can slide on the wall front to back, that's the sagittal plane. If I can slide along the wall side to side, that's the frontal plane. And then you can't really do the wall example, but like if I go to like place my hand on a desk and I slide along it up and down, right? Like I'm not going up and down, but like I've got an upper section and a lower section, you know, above the desk and below the desk, and I slide, that's transverse stuff. So the sagittal plane, like I said, bisects the body into right and left sides. And so the movements in the sagittal plane, there's a couple movements here. And this one's probably the simplest, right? You got flexion and you've got extension, okay? And again, these are opposites of one another, okay? So the movements that, you know, if you've got flexion, you know it's in the sagittal plane. If you got extension, you know it's in the sagittal plane, right? Those are the only places these movements exist. So flexion is a bending movement where the angle decreases. So the angle is going to go from a high number to a low number, right? So picture like, picture an angle, right? I'm going to try my best to do this as we go, right? So this angle here, right? This is 180 degrees. Right, so it's a flat angle, right? Whereas like this is now 90 degrees, right? If I remember my geometry, which I was never very good at, right? So this is 180 degrees, right? So 180, and then this angle here is 90 degrees, right? So if I went from 180 degrees with my arm here, right, is a flat line, that's 180, and I take it to here, that's 90. If I take it to here, that's 45, 30, right, about. I don't know, what, 125? Beats me. That's 180, right? So if I'm decreasing the angle, right, that's going to be flexion. Now we also have to have the opposite of that. The opposite of that's going to be extension. So flexion, extension, right? So if I do that in my elbow, that's elbow flexion. If I did it in my shoulder, that's shoulder flexion versus shoulder extension, right? If I do it in my hip, that's hip flexion versus hip extension, right? That's what we're going to do. That's how we're going to speak this language. So a bicep curl is going to be flexion. A tricep press down is going to be extension. A squat is going to be extension. A knee raise is going to be flexion, right? So there's a lot of different terms here that take place in the sagittal plane, right? So knee flexion is moving the leg closer to the thigh, right? Knee flexion, right? I've got my knee here and I flex it, right? And so there we go. I'm like moving the bone closer, right? But the angle, it's 180 right now. Now the angle is what? What is that? Probably 45, maybe 30, maybe 30. I don't know. I don't have a protractor on me, but like there we go, right? The angle's decreasing. There it is at 90, 180, right? So if the angle's increasing, right? So if I go from 45 up to 90, up to 180, that's extension. So those are the two movements that take place, or two of the movements that take place in the sagittal plane. And they're probably two of the most common versions, right? So flexion would be a bicep curl, a hamstring curl, a mountain climber, right? You're driving your knees in towards your chest, right? Versus extension, which would be like a squat. You're coming out of a squat, a tricep press down, right? Or like a Superman is a good example of extension, right? That's a little bit of what we call hyperextension, because it's actually going into like an exaggerated range of motion. But like if she went from here and then like even further, right? She's eventually she would get all the way like you ever see what's that exercise? What's that abdominal stretch you see people do? This one here, right? I meant like if she laid flat, she's 180. Now she's at 360 degrees, right? Like the angle kept going up. That's why this is very much hyper extension, but it is extension because the angle would go from, flat, she's a little more flat here, right? To this extreme intense high angle, right? 180 up to 360. Right. So that's hyperextension. You go even further with hyperextension if you ever go like all the way around a joint. Don't do that. There's also hyperflexion, by the way. Like hyperflexion is kind of what you do if anybody in here cracks their knuckles, and you're just like really pressing super hard, you're kind of hyperflexing in that example. Never hear about hyperflexing because nobody ever, it doesn't come up very often. So that's the sagittal plane, right? Flexion, a bending movement where the segment angle decreases. Extension, a bending movement where the segment angle increases. And then hyperextension is going beyond normal range of motion. Does that make sense, everybody? Everybody got a pretty good idea of flexion extension? Cool. These are probably our biggest terms. This is like if we got to understand this before we can understand any of the stuff coming down for the rest of this course. So if you got a question, you need a review, please feel free to chime in. Next one we've got kind of a fun one here. We have got dorsiflexion versus plantar flexion. Now, what the heck? Kinesiologists, why the heck do we have two flexions here? If they're opposites, why are they both flexions? Well, your foot is a very unique joint, at least angle wise, right? Can you imagine being a scientist and like labeling everything out and you're like, this is great. The whole body is just stacked straight up. This is so easy, right? Everything just kind of goes this way. But then you got this one bone, this one joint that comes out from the body at a right angle, you know, like the freaking ankle joint, right? You know, everything is so good and easy to understand. And then you get this one freaking bone that just happens to be coming out of the body, you know, at an angle like this. Screws everything up. You got to use a different terminology. Plantar and dorsy come from Latin words that I do not remember the origins of. Let's see here. Dorsy prefix. What does that mean? I don't remember. The back. Okay, yeah, that's right. Because it's, oh yeah, that's right. Because it's dorsal, right? Versus like plantar, which is the bot to spread. Yeah, that's what it is. It's like spreading butter. I would literally plantar, and I don't know why I always thought butter, but yeah, you'd spread it. So the foot is spreading away from the body, right? And the dorsy is like, you know, it's towards the back. Anyway, can you imagine, just what a pain in the butt. So, so this joint had to get special terms. So these are both actually kind of an example of flexion and extension, even though they're both called flexions. And it's, so you have dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion is where you are bringing your toes up towards the rest of your body, right? So your dorsy, right? You are coming towards your body, right? Dorsiflexion is where your anterior, like, you know, this example, the anterior tibialis, that's your shin muscle, right? Is pulling your toes towards you. That's dorsiflexion, right? Or you're letting up the gas, right? And then plantar flexion is pointing your toe away. So if we look at the difference between like plantar flexion versus dorsiflexion, you can see, right? Oh, that's perfect. This girl's doing a good example of like both these simultaneously, right? So she's got this foot dorsiflexed. You can tell me that girl is not a dancer, by the way. Look at those freaking dancer calluses. Anyway, and then you've got plantar flexion. Plantar flexion, she's pointing her toes away, right? So plantar flexion, dorsiflexion in the ankle. By the way, that only exists in the ankle. It's the only that's the only time we ever use that term. So those are all your sagittal plane movements, right? Flexion, decreasing the angle, extension, increasing the angle, dorsiflexion, pulling your toe back towards you, plantar flexion, pointing your toe away. You guys know I gotta ask. Questions, comments, concerns?
No, thank you.
Okay. All right, let's do our next plane. So we've got the frontal plane. So this is going to divide us into an anterior and posterior side. These are our side-to-side movements, right? So the frontal plane bisects the body into front and back halves. You got a couple extra movements here. You are going to have abduction and you are going to have adduction. I apologize if those sound really similar on the computer. Like I'm sure my microphone's not perfect, but sometimes it can be really hard to hear the difference between abduction and adduction. I will try my best to enunciate. Sometimes you'll hear people call this abduction or adduction. But that drives me crazy. And I'm sorry, I just can't use those terms. So abduction, here's the easiest way to remember that, right? If you're honestly, my arms are being abducted by aliens, right? I am moving in the frontal plane away from my midline. Okay. If I could, and I can't do this, right? Does anybody know how to do this, by the way, where they can move their eyes away? This way, like I can do the cross-eyed thing, but I can't go this way. We have a dog in our house with like one lazy eye, and it's abducting away, right? It goes away from the midline. So abducting is moving away from the midline, similar to like lateral, right? If you're going from medial to lateral, you are abducting your body part. So abduction is movement away. So a lateral raise, right? Honestly, a shoulder press right? I know it doesn't look like it because I'm doing like all this overhead stuff, but look, this joint, this bone here, it's abducting away from the midline. Now it does go all the way around and suddenly starts going back towards the midline. But again, remember guys, what's our starting position? Down here, it's the anatomic position. So yes, at some point it starts moving back towards, but that's not how we label it. It's always still abduction. So abduction is moving away from the midline, your lateral raise, your shoulder press, hip abduction, where you're raising your leg out at the side, right? Or side shuffling. You think about like side shuffling, I shuffled to the side, right? Technically, side shuffling has adduction in it as well. Because here's the thing about a side shuffle, right? Like I'm gonna abduct with my right leg, but then I have to adduct with my left leg. But like if you're moving in one direction, we generally consider that to be abduction because you're concentrically, you're accelerating in one direction. Adduction, going toward the midline, right? Adduction is also a frontal plane movement heading inwards, right? So again, we go back to the gym. And you look at that machine that you sometimes see in gyms, right? There's sort of this one right here, right? So with the pads this way, he's going to squeeze inward. That's adduction. He's adding his thighs together, right? But then he can take those little pads and you flip, the machine, you pull the pin, you flip it, and then you flip it around, and then suddenly you press away, right? And you are abducting them away. Again, easiest way I remember this, there you go. There's the two sides of it. She's got the abduction version there. She's got the adduction version there. Or, that version. That machine, by the way, sucks. Don't use that machine. Way too many clients have excessive adduction. If you're going to use it, use the one where you're opening this way. But honestly, I would much rather my client, use like a resistance band clamshell or side shuffle or, something like that. But abduction, like I said, it's your arms are being abducted by aliens, right? They're going away from the midline. That's the easiest way for me to remember that. Now, there is another special ankle movement here, the freaking ankle. The ankle ruins everything. Oh, you know what? Sorry, I'm not there yet. One more movement that's kind of unique. You also have what we're going to call lateral flexion. Now, you have to say them together. It has to be lateral flexion, not just flexion. Flexion is a sagittal movement. Lateral flexion, though, is a frontal plane movement. And this only takes place at your spine. So we had to have a special term for this thing that runs down the center of our body, our spine, right? So remember, if the angle is decreasing, like actually my zipper here, you can use that as a frame of reference, right? If the angle's decreasing, right? So now there's less of an angle, right? This was 180, but now the angle's decreasing on this side. That's lateral flexion, right? So lateral flexion is this side-to-side movement here. Now, where's lateral extension? If we have if we have flexion, shouldn't we have extension? Yes and no, not really. Like we either decided to call this lateral extension or we would call it lateral flexion. We chose to call it lateral flexion because the muscles are contracting to pull you this way. And we're always labeling stuff based on how it's contracting, not on how it's relaxing. So my right side is lateral flexion. Technically, my left side is doing lateral extension. Technically, that is true if I were bending to my right. But we just don't have to label that. We don't have to have that term because we only label it based on when the muscle's shortening. And this side that's extending is relaxing. So if we were like, let's say you had a client with excessive lateral flexion to their left, well, then you know that all you need to do is train them for lateral flexion to the right, and that will pull the Jenga tower back to straight. So lateral flexion is like a solo term. So it's like one of the only ones that's all by itself. But tilting your head side to side, or like doing side bends, right? That's lateral flexion. And that doesn't count for like other joints. Think about like your wrist, right? It's like I can do a side-to-side movement with my wrist too. Would that be lateral flexion? No. Like that's either going toward the midline or away from the midline. That's adduction or abduction of the wrist. The spine's unique. It's the very center of your body. But this is not. This is off to one side. So it's either moving towards the midline or away from the midline. So we don't have to use that term anywhere else. It literally only exists in the spine. Lateral flexion does not come up very often, by the way. Like I can't even think of the last time I used that term. Now, ankle again, the friggin' ankle has to be unique. The ankle has to get all of its own special terms. It's a, it's a pampered special joint that gets special treatment and special terms. This is going to be eversion and inversion, which are still frontal plane movements, by the way. But eversion is moving your foot towards, you're moving your, sorry, I start with eversion. I normally start with inversion. Eversion is moving your heel bone away from the midline. So it's kind of like abduction of the ankle. It's moving away from the midline. Whereas inversion, so you can see this is eversion here, right? The foot is moving away from the midline versus inversion, which is moving towards the midline. Inversion is moving your heel bone, moving the bottom of your foot towards your midline. So for instance, I'll try to show you this. This is gonna be tough to kind of see, but you can see if I take my foot up, right? If I move my foot inward, I'm showing the bottom of my foot towards the midline. That's inversion. If I show the bottom of my foot away from the midline, that's eversion. These are probably two of the most important terms we are going to learn today, because almost every client you run into is going to have a lot of like eversion, inversion problems. The ankle is just a very dysfunctional joint in a lot of clients. It's our foundation. So I guess it's probably not necessarily more dysfunctional than any other joint, but I say that because it's probably the most important. So we put a lot of emphasis on it. So many clients are going to have excessive eversion of the foot. And again, that kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier. If we look at this excessive eversion, right? Eversion is where the foot's going away from the midline. Inversion was going towards the midline. So now imagine if you spent all day in inversion, right? And by the way, you can sprain, you got ligaments on both sides of this, but most of our clients are going to spend all day everted. So we see a lot of posture like this. How often do you guys see people's feet flattening down and then like turned out just a little bit, right? See that posture all the time. We call that pronation, which that one we'll get to in just a moment. So you spend all day like this. So what ends up happening is this ligament over here on the lateral side, it gets used to being in a shortened position. It gets used to being, in a contracted bit, right? Rather than like stretched out. God, sorry about that, guys. So because it's used to being here and not used to being here, one day you step in a hole, or step off a step the wrong way, or just roll your ankle, right? And then all of a sudden you invert it, but you're not used to inverting it because that ligament's used to being this length. So then it should be able to move to a range of motion like this, but it can't anymore because it got used to being in this position. All of a sudden you sprain your ankle. And that is why the lateral ankle sprain, this one in particular, is the most common injury in all of sports. It's the #1 injury that people deal with. And it's because most of us spend our time everted instead of neutral. For the record, if you spend most of your day inverted, you could probably get a medial ankle sprain, but that one's a little bit more rare. We don't see it very often. So that is inversion versus eversion. That is our frontal plane. Questions, comments? How you guys feeling about that stuff? The ankle stuff get confusing, or are we good?
We good.
A little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, the ankle is confusing. because it gets all these special, terms, right? Basically, I always tell people like memorize the terms in general: flexion, extension, right? Abduction, adduction, and then go back and start your ankle. Dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. This is my ankle. Inversion towards the midline, eversion away from the midline, right? Foot away, everted. Foot in, like the bottom of your foot, that's inverted. That's another way to remember it. In for in.
I think we should repeat it every day to remind.
Do it. Please do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Open your day with this video.
Very confusing.
All right. So the next one we got is the transverse plane. This is the largest list, but I think this is actually one of the easier ones. So the transverse plane is going to divide you again into an upper and a lower portion. And so you're going to move along that cut, right? So spinny movements, right? So we've got internal rotation and we've got external rotation. Internal rotation is rotating towards the midline. External rotation is rotating away from the midline. Now there is also left-right rotation, which is pretty unique. That one's just really just your head, like left to right, right to left, like, and that one's a kind of a unique one as well. And then we do have the horizontal version of this. The one thing we haven't covered is like our special shoulder joint here, which has a little bit of what we call horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. If we've looked at the shoulder so far, right, we've looked at, because your ball and socket joint can literally do everything, right? So we've looked at it do flexion, we've looked at it do extension, we've looked at it do abduction, we've looked at it do adduction, internal rotation, and external rotation. The one thing we haven't covered is going from like an abducted place and then going to the front of the body. What the heck is this? Well, remember, our transverse plane cuts us this way. There's a woodpecker. Can you guys hear that? There's a woodpecker outside my window. Sorry. So they got the transverse plane, right? We twist, right? So it's the twisting motion. But that slide, think of it like if I was on actually I can do it on my bed here, right? If I slid on my bed like this, like a chest fly or a reverse fly or a row or a press, right? Those are what we call horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. So I am adding or I'm taking away, I'm abducting towards my midline again. So we're kind of putting a little bit of transverse and a little bit of frontal together with that one. But those are kind of special. And then we got pronation and supination, which really put them together. Good Lord. Can you guys hear that? Can anybody hear that?
I think I can. It's not going on right now, is it?
No.
Oh,
It's crazy. It's like there's a freaking machine gun outside my window. I feel like I'm being April Fool's pranked here. All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and go through. So internal rotation is movement along the longitudinal axis. It's twisty movement towards the midline. So again, if I take my wrist from the anatomic position, which would be, palm facing this way, right? In this example, because normally my arm would be at my side, so palm would be facing forward, right? And I twist it away from my midline, right? That's going to be external rotation. If I twist it towards my midline, that's going to be internal rotation. So again, palm inward, I'm rotating towards my midline. That's internal rotation, right? Or palm outward, that's external rotation. What if I bend my elbow, right? Shoulder, external rotation, shoulder, internal rotation. I can move my arm over here. It's still external rotation and internal rotation. Doesn't matter where my arm is. Again, anatomic position, right? So internal rotation is moving in, external rotation is moving out. And I put some example exercises in my notes, but honestly, that's what they're called. It's a cable internal rotation where you grab the cable machine, you go inward. And then there's cable external rotation going outwards. I feel bad that those example exercises are named after their movements perfectly, but they are kind of a good example. Just like a dumb lateral raise, like, yeah, of course that's lateral. So then we've got horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction, right? And again, that's going to be abduction because I am pulling my arms away from my midline. That's a row. A row is abduction, and a chest press is adduction, adding them back to my midline, right? Think of a chest fly. Horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. And that's the only joint that exists in, by the way. So most of our clients with their rounded shoulder posture have excessive horizontal adduction, and they need to work on horizontal abduction. So most of our clients need more upper back work. That is a priority for clients with slumped shoulders, you know, and I'm one of them. So the reverse fly, rowing actions, those are gonna be really good for our clients. Chest flies, bench presses, they tend to be everybody's favorite. But if you've already got really bad shoulder rounding, they might be holding you back a little bit. One other, and then other, I didn't put this in the notes, that's weird. Other one we've got for rotation, we've got pronation and supination. Remember we talked about that, you know, twisting up or twisting down. Those are also transverse movements. They're rotational movements. You're either producing force or reducing force. But again, I'm moving supine, give me sup, or I'm moving prone. All right, how's the transverse stuff, guys? How you feel on that one?
Getting it.
Right. To be fair, what really helps with this stuff is when we move into like Wednesday and Thursday, and I'm like, all right, so you're gonna supinate, you're gonna do, you know, we're gonna use them in sentences, which really helps it click. Okay, so now we got to look at the scapula. Now these are not necessarily like planes of movement or anything like that. These are just scapular motions. So your scapula is a very unique bone. It is, you know, situated at kind of a right angle, but it kind of hangs off the body. And so it can move in all of these kind of interesting ways, right? So we're going to have a couple scapular terms directly here. We're going to have 4 of them, right? So you are going to have scapular retraction and scapular protraction. Now, these are definitely associated with some of the movements we saw a minute ago. For instance, scapular retraction, right? That's actually pulling your shoulder blades together. You are adding them in the back, right? You're adducting them together, right? You're adding them both to your midline. So when we think of that horizontal abduction movement, right? That's actually a really good example of scapular adduction, which would be so freaking confusing, right? Abduction is an example of adduction, right? That would blow everybody's brain up. So instead, the scapula gets its special terms. You have retraction, which is retracting your shoulder blades together. You're pulling them back, right? Retracted, right? You get a tape measure and you let go of it and it snaps back. It retracts back into itself. A snail looks out and it's like, screw that. And then like retracts into it. Oh, I guess, no, sorry, not a snail, a turtle, right? It protracts its head, looks around, sees a bird, goes, nope, and then retracts its head back into its shell. So retracting is pulling it backwards, right? So your scapula pulling together in the back, that's retraction. Protraction is rounding them around into the front. So your shoulder blades moving away and rounding around the body, that's going to be protraction. Pulling them back closer together, that's going to be retraction. You've also got shoulder elevation, or scapular elevation, I should say, which is moving them upwards. And you've got scapular depression, which is moving them downwards. So you can see our examples here, right? Retraction, they come together. Protraction, they go away. Depression, they drop down. By the way, depression doesn't happen much. You can see it's not exactly a big movement, but elevation's really big. Then I've got lots of depression, right? So there is sort of a difference between those two there. But yeah, there's not a lot of scapular depression. Most of the time you're sitting there with your scapula, or at least you should be. A lot of our clients actually have excessive sort of elevation. They sit like all tense like this all day. There's like stressed out people, and it's like, hey, relax. You know, they need a little bit more scapular depression. Those are your biggest movements. Now, all we've got left today, guys, like I said, I told you these notes move a little quick. It just takes up a lot of space. All we got left is to look at how our muscles contract. We're just going to look at some of the three ways. We've got three different ways that our muscles contract. And once we understand that, I'll leave you alone. We'll let the brain cool down. You can start getting some of this terminology in. I always recommend making some flashcards. I'm actually going to talk about this in a couple days, but we will have an extra credit assignment. Now, just so you guys are aware, obviously, when it comes to extra credit, I can't give you any points towards things. Like, you know, I can't take, let's say you get like an 85 on your homework. I can't turn that into a 90. But what I can do is if you miss a day of class, I can give you attendance. It doesn't have a huge impact. It helps, right? You have to maintain 80% attendance. If you've ever missed a class, this can make up for it. But I will do one extra credit assignment this module, which I will talk about in a few days, but it's going to be to make flashcards for the kinesiology class. Because I do think, I don't love memorization, but I do think when it comes to kinesiology, the best way to learn it is just to get that language in your brain, and flashcards are the best way to do that. So look forward to that in a couple days. I don't want to talk too much about it today. I just want to kind of foreshadow, but I will talk about that on Thursday. We'll talk about it. All right, let's talk about muscle actions. So those were all the bones, right? We had all, look at all this terminology. Look at all this bone stuff, right? So we talked about like how our bones move. Let's talk about how the muscles move those bones, right? So we've got various muscle actions. Now a muscle's action, right, is what the muscle does when it is actively shortening. So remember, go back to our anatomy lesson from the muscular system just a couple days ago, right? Go back to that lesson and remember what I said. Muscles can pull and they can relax. They cannot push, right? They can pull and then they can let go, and they can pull and they can let go, right? They can't push in the opposite direction. Muscles can only pull. So that's why we have to have an antagonist muscle on the other side of the joint to pull us back the other way, right? If I pull my bicep here, I'd be stuck like this. But luckily I've got my tricep, which can pull in the opposite direction. So those muscles need to be able to pull and relax, or they need to like just pull and then hold and like stabilize. So we got three muscle actions here. Now, because scientists love to break stuff into two categories, we have two categories here. You don't need two categories. I honestly barely need you to know this term. But we do have what are called isotonic contractions. These are contractions that occur like moving, okay? Whereas isometric involves not moving. So isotonic is a contraction that involves either shortening a muscle or lengthening a muscle. And an isometric contraction is holding the muscle still. So don't worry about that category. Just memorize these three, okay? So of the two isotonics, the first one we'll start with is what's called an eccentric or eccentric muscle action. This occurs when the muscle is developing tension while it's lengthening. So this is a muscle that is stretching. That's an eccentric contraction. The muscle is lengthening because it's generating force, but it's generating less force than whatever resistance it's working against. If it's working against a 5-pound dumbbell, the muscle is generating 4 pounds of force, right? So if I had like a dumbbell in my arm, right, and let's say it's 10 pounds, and I generate 8 pounds of force, that's less, right? So my arm's going to lower down, right? That's an eccentric. The muscle is going to be pulled apart. So eccentric is the muscle lengthening. You can think of this when you think of like force reduction, when you are lowering the bar down in a bench press, right? You are eccentrically lowering it. When you are letting the bar back up in a lat pull down, you're putting it back into position, right? To relax it, that's eccentric. You are force reducing. You are sitting into a chair, like as you relax, right? That's force reduction. That's an eccentric contraction. Now, we will often list out our tempo when we're telling our clients how we want them to lift. And so in exercise tempo, we always list that as the first number. The first number always represents the eccentric portion of the movement. So, oh, I forgot. We are about to get to my 3 favorite slides in all of Sochi. Oh, I forgot about this. So eccentric actions, right? This guy is clearly not a cat lover. He is lowering the cat away, right? So his bicep muscle is generating less force than however much this cat weighs. That cat weighs 8 pounds. His bicep is generating less than 8 pounds of force. So the cat is going to move away, right? So the muscle is lengthening. It's being pulled apart. That's the negative portion of a rep. So the negative portion of the rep is always the first number whenever we're labeling this out. So if I told somebody to do a 4-2-1 tempo and they're doing a shoulder press, right? They might do something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see how much slower the lowering is, okay? So that's eccentric. Now, the opposite of eccentric is concentric. Concentric occurs when the muscle is shortening. This is the pulling action. This is probably what you think of when you think of like a muscle contracting. Technically, all 3 of these are contractions, but this is sort of the traditional version that we usually think of, right? This occurs when the muscle is shortening. So the muscle shortens because it's generating more force than whatever resistance it's working against. So this guy doesn't like cats. He does like puppies, right? So the puppy's down here. Let's say it weighs 8 pounds. He's going to generate more than 8 pounds of force. Therefore, his bicep muscle is going to slide. It's going to do the sliding filament model, and it's going to shorten and bring that muscle, it's going to drag the bone upwards, right? So concentric actions occur when the muscle is shortening. So a muscle shortens because it's generating greater force. You can think of this as force production, right? So force reduction was eccentric. Like if I caught something, I reduced its force, I slowed it down, I eccentrically moved it, right? But if I threw something away, I accelerated it, right? I produced force. That's another thing you can think of when you think of like eccentric. You can think of it as decelerating. Or concentric is accelerating, speeding up versus slowing down. So this is always our 3rd number whenever we're listing this, because they need to be on opposite sides of things, concentric and eccentric. So the 1, in a 4-2-1 tempo, this would be the shortening position. This would be the lifting action, right? So again, in my shoulder press example, if I was eccentrically slowly down, right, I'd concentrically, if that was like a 1, I would go fast. I'd produce force, right? And then lastly, we've got isometric. And here's my favorite slide ever. There's isometric, which is like, look at this guy's, he does not love alligators. He is going to isometrically hold that alligator as far away as he can, right? He's not going to produce force because if he throws it away, it might come back at him. He's not going to reduce force because obviously he does not want to bring this alligator towards him. But if he holds it, he can just figure out what to do, right? So that's isometric. Isometric means you are going to hold it in one position. This involves no change in length. The muscle's not getting pulled apart. It's not shortening. It's just staying put. So this occurs when the muscle stays the same way. It is generating an equal amount of force to whatever resistance it's working against. If I had 10 pounds in my hand and I held it right here, and I just hold it there, that's an isometric contraction, right? The muscle stays the same length. Generally, when we think of like learning how to stabilize, we're focused on learning how to isometrically contract our muscles. Isometric contractions are going to be our stabilization movements. So in our tempo, we're going to put that in the middle because it is usually in the middle, right? Think about a 4-2-1 tempo, right? I would go up for 1 because that's the concentric portion, down for 4 because that's the eccentric portion, and I would hold for 2, either here or here, and that's going to be the isometric portion. Now, there are some special terms you'll sometimes hear floating around, but honestly, they don't come up very often. Sometimes you'll hear isokinetic. That occurs when like a muscle is contracting, but at a very constant speed. So like there's a machine that will keep you from being able to move too fast or too slow. We don't ever see it in regular gyms. You'll see they look like this. Not this stuff at the top, by the way. This machine right here. So see how she has to wear like a seatbelt? She's going to try to contract really fast, but the machine is actually going to slow her down. She can only move so quickly. That is an isokinetic machine. Same thing in the other direction too, by the way. So you have to strap the patient in. It's really good for physical therapy. It's really good for like teaching your muscles how to turn back on if they've been completely messed up. But really, those are the only places you're ever going to see those. So those are our 3 muscle actions, right? And that is all of our biomechanics. So it all starts to kind of come together, right? Biomechanics is looking at how internal and external forces are sort of working. When your muscle is contracting, it's going to create one of our joint actions that we talked about earlier, right? If my anterior deltoid shortens concentrically, it will perform shoulder flexion. Now, generally, the way that we use this, let's say I've got a client with excessive shoulder, actually I can sit. Let's say I got a client with excessive shoulder elevation, right? They kind of walk around like this all day. They got this kind of like super tense posture. Well, now all I need to do is understand what joint action is happening and remember what the opposite of that joint action is. So this is scapular elevation. They need more scapular depression. Now I need to look at what muscle is going to concentrically pull to cause shoulder elevation. And I need to look at what muscle is going to concentrically pull to perform depression. And if I can look at that, I'm going to know what muscle I need to stretch because it's doing too much concentric work. And I'm going to need to know what muscle to strengthen because it's not doing enough concentric work, right? So concentrically, in this case, it's my upper trapezius that's doing too much work. And concentrically, it's my lower trapezius that needs to do more work. So I need to stretch the one doing too much work, and I need to strengthen the one done doing enough work. And if I do that, I can fix my client's posture. So that's going to be the second half of this course. We got one more day of terminology tomorrow, where we'll look at some of our concepts related to human movement. That's really going to kind of just like set the tone. But today was day 4. So this is your homework number 2 is going to go out today. So guys, everybody is going to go to canvas.instructure.com. We have that bookmarked. And then you're going to click here and you're going to go down to day 4 and you're going to Click day 4, and there it is. Click here to take homework number 2. You click that, your button will say start, mine says preview, but take it, practice it, get used to it. And those are the 2 pieces of homework that are going to be in your midterm. So we are meeting up this Wednesday. I will get to see you guys in person on Wednesday, which I'm super excited about. We're going to use some of this terminology. We're going to analyze movements, and we're going to look to see what we need to do in order to kind of fix these postural distortions that we often run into. But other than that, guys, that is everything I've got for you today. Any questions before I let you guys go?
Anything to bring on Wednesday?
You know, honestly, just make sure you definitely wear, like, it doesn't have to be shorts, but like be able to move on Wednesday. I know sometimes, like, I love David, but he'd show up in jeans like every time, and I was like, dude, you got to lose the jeans, like, I need you in shorts, But other than that, you should be good. Bring a notebook, bring a pencil, Oh, you know what? It's probably a good idea. We got a pretty large group again. Probably a pretty good idea. Bring your foam roller. That foam roller that's in your bag, definitely bring that.
So basically just gym attire then, huh?
Yeah, gym attire, foam roller, notebook, and a pencil.
Brad, sorry, I missed it. Can you repeat it one more time?
Yes. So notebook, bring a notebook, and bring a pen. Bring your foam roller, and bring, wear an outfit that you can move it through a full range of motion.
When?
Wednesday.
Wednesday. Okay.
So remember the first day of class. Remember check your first day email. I put the days we're gonna meet. We're meeting on Wednesday.
Yeah.
At Sochi, 9 a.m. not 8:30, and 6 p.m. not 5:30. 9 and 6.
Okay.
Check the email. I will send another email, but don't forget to check it will have all the instructions.
Oh, that what we bring and everything?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. And that email will go out tomorrow. All right, guys. So I'll let you all out of here. Good luck on homework number 2, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye.
Later.
Later. Okay.